The missile alert reaches Tel Aviv 7 minutes before impact. Not one alert, dozens of them, cascading across the early warning network that Israel has built over decades precisely for this moment. The Iron Dome batteries activate, David's Sling radars acquire the incoming threats, Arrow 3 interceptors are assigned to the highest altitude ballistic trajectories. This is not the April 2024 exchange. That was a calibrated demonstration, Iran launching and Israel responding, both sides carefully managing the escalation ladder to avoid the next step. This is what happens when the calibration breaks down, when one side decides that demonstrating resolve is no longer enough, when the threshold that both sides have carefully avoided for decades is finally crossed. This video does not predict that this will happen. It analyzes what would actually occur if it did. This is the command structure. Let's break it down. The hostility between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the State of Israel is one of the most durable and consequential antagonisms in modern geopolitics. Before 1979, Iran and Israel maintained a relationship of tacit strategic cooperation. That relationship ended abruptly and permanently with the Islamic Revolution. The new Islamic Republic operationalized its opposition through the establishment and support of Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, through sustained support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and through the construction of the Axis of Resistance, a network of aligned armed groups from Tehran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to Gaza. Israel's response evolved from primarily defensive measures to what became known as the Campaign Between the Wars: covert strikes, assassinations, Stuxnet, hundreds of Syria airstrikes. The April and October 2024 direct exchanges represent a qualitative shift. For the first time, both states directly attacked each other's territory with acknowledged military forces. Hezbollah maintains an estimated arsenal of 100,000 to 150,000 rockets and missiles, the most significant non-state rocket force in history. The Houthi movement in Yemen has demonstrated operational capability to conduct long-range strikes against Israeli territory using ballistic missiles and drones, as evidenced by their sustained campaign since October 2023. This proxy architecture forces Israel to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, fragments its air defense resources across multiple threat axes, and imposes costs not directly attributable to Iran's own military action. The trajectory is one of progressively raising stakes, progressively eroding the implicit rules of engagement that govern the shadow war, and progressively building the momentum toward the next escalation. Understanding this trajectory is essential to understanding why a full-scale war, while not inevitable, is no longer structurally implausible. The IRGC's aerospace force operates Iran's ballistic and cruise missile arsenal, its most significant direct military capability against Israel. This force controls the Shahab series, the Ahmad, the Khorramshahr, and the Fatah hypersonic missile, though Western assessments of its operational status vary. Supreme Command Authority flows through the Supreme Leader to the IRGC Commander and the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, with the Supreme National Security Council as the deliberative body for major security decisions. The War Cabinet brings together the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, and selected senior ministers alongside the Chief of the General Staff and intelligence heads. This body would be the decision-making forum for any escalation decision. Israel's layered missile defense, the most developed in the world, faces one critical constraint in a prolonged conflict: the ammunition consumption rate that a full-scale war would impose. Hezbollah's rocket and missile force is the single most significant threat to the Israeli home front in any direct conflict. Now, the significant caveat: Hezbollah has never used this force in the mass simultaneous launch mode that would be required to saturate Israel's layered missile defense. The 2024 conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has degraded but not eliminated its capability. The key variable is the degree to which pre-conflict degradation has reduced its precision-guided munition inventory and senior military command structure. The United States demonstrated in April 2024 that it would provide direct military support to Israel in a large-scale Iranian attack. This demonstrated willingness to engage defensively does not automatically translate into willingness to conduct offensive strikes against Iranian territory. Whether a full-scale Israel-Iran exchange would cross the threshold that changes the U.S. calculus is genuinely unknowable in advance. Iran's medium-range ballistic missiles, the Shahab 3 and its derivatives, can reach Israeli territory from Iranian launch sites. Iran's one-way attack drone force, primarily the Shahed 136, offers a different capability profile: slower than ballistic missiles, potentially available in very large numbers, operating at low altitude to evade radar. The April 2024 exchange demonstrated that Israel, with Allied support, could intercept a large percentage of Shahed drones. But in a scenario involving hundreds or thousands of drones, the saturation mathematics change significantly. Iron Dome has demonstrated interception rates above 90% in operational conditions. Its limitation in a full-scale war scenario is quantitative. Each battery contains 20 Tamir interceptors per launcher, and the time required to replenish under active attack creates a finite defense capacity. The sustainable operations question is the most significant material constraint Israel faces. A sustained campaign that exhausts Israel's interceptor inventory faster than it can be replenished changes the operational situation fundamentally. This is precisely the logic behind Iran's strategy of quantity over quality in its drone and rocket campaigns. Israel's F-35I Adir aircraft have reduced radar cross-section. Its F-15I Ram carries substantial weapons payload over 1,000 to 2,000 kilometer ranges. The geographic constraint, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers from Israeli air bases to Iranian nuclear facilities. This requires transit through Jordan and Saudi Arabia, or longer alternative routes. Aerial refueling is the critical enabler. Israel's tanker fleet is relatively small, at approximately 8K C-130H aircraft, which limits the size of strike packages it can support at maximum range. These constraints mean that an Israeli strike against Iran would not look like the comprehensive simultaneous attacks Israel has conducted against closer targets. It would be a more constrained operation with harder choices about target prioritization. A full-scale Iran-Israel war would involve simultaneous fire from 5 directions: Lebanon to the north, Gaza and the West Bank to the southwest, Yemen to the south, Iraq to the east, and Iran to the northeast. Managing simultaneous threats from 5 different directions with overlapping coverage requirements places extraordinary demands on the integrated air defense system's command and control. In this scenario, the trigger is assumed to be an Israeli strike on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. Multiple simultaneous targets, including Fordo, Natanz, Arak, and selected IRGC missile and Air Force bases. The IRGC Aerospace Force would launch from multiple sites in Iran and from proxy positions, targeting Israeli military bases, the Dimona Nuclear Research Facility, Ben Gurion Airport, and infrastructure nodes. The opening hours would be defined by simultaneous fire in both directions and simultaneous interception in both directions. Israel's Arrow 3 system would engage incoming Iranian ballistic missiles at exoatmospheric altitudes. Arrow 2 would engage at lower altitudes. David's Sling would handle medium-range threats. Iron Dome would be reserved for shorter-range threats from Lebanon and Gaza. From Lebanon, Hezbollah's rocket forces would be launching simultaneously to saturate Iron Dome and force Israel to divide its attention. Whether Hezbollah launches its full force or holds precision-guided munitions in reserve is a command decision of enormous operational consequence. If the exchange continues beyond the initial 24 to 48 hours, the conflict would expand to regional fronts. The Houthi front from Yemen would escalate to maximum effort launches. Iraqi Shia militia groups would activate against U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. The Syrian front would become an active theater. The presence of Russian forces in Syria introduces a specific complication. Would Russian air defense systems engage Israeli aircraft operating over Syria? If the conflict continues into a sustained campaign, the character of the war would be shaped by each side's specific capabilities and limitations. Israel's initial surprise element is available only in the opening phase. As the war progresses, Iranian military assets that have survived become mobile, dispersed, and harder to find. Iran's counter-campaign would target Israeli infrastructure nodes, air bases, port facilities, power generation, desalination plants. The ammunition consumption question becomes decisive in this phase. The side that exhausts its military capacity first faces a coercion threshold the other can exploit. The U.S. decision on direct military involvement would be the most consequential variable. The threshold for offensive U.S. military operations against Iran would be set by 2 possible triggers: an attack on U.S. military personnel or facilities, or a presidential determination that Iran's military power required direct suppression. Iraqi Shia militia attacks on U.S. bases, almost certain in this scenario, could provide the first trigger. If the United States commits to offensive operations, U.S. B-2 and B-21 bombers can deliver bunker buster munitions, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, that can reach hardened underground facilities that Israel's aircraft cannot access. The nuclear dimension cannot be ignored. Iran does not currently possess nuclear weapons. This is the established position of the international community based on IAEA monitoring and intelligence community assessments. In a scenario in which Iranian conventional military pressure crosses thresholds Israel assesses as existential, the question of nuclear deterrence becomes acute. And this is not a scenario in which nuclear use is assessed as likely. It is a scenario in which the possibility exists, and the management of that possibility would be a defining feature of any ceasefire negotiation. A coercive pause, rather than a formal ceasefire or decisive military victory, is the most historically consistent outcome for conflicts of this type. This is the pattern of the 2006 Lebanon War, of multiple Gaza conflicts, and of the 2024 direct exchange cycle. Iran's regional influence through its proxy network would be substantially tested. A full-scale war would involve a comprehensive decapitation campaign against the proxy network's military leadership, logistics, and weapons stockpiles. Iran's nuclear program would face existential decisions. Had the political pressure on Iran's leadership after a devastating conventional exchange would push in two directions, toward nuclear breakout as a deterrent against future attacks, and toward negotiated settlement trading nuclear concessions for security guarantees. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of global oil supply and 20% of global LNG trade. Even a partial disruption would produce immediate and significant energy price spikes. Israeli economic infrastructure would face direct attack for the first time. The Haifa port complex, Ben Gurion airport, power generation, and desalination infrastructure. The global shipping insurance market would respond to a full-scale regional war in ways extending beyond the Strait of Hormuz. The economic consequences would extend worldwide. A full-scale Iran-Israel war would be the most demanding operational test of missile defense systems in history. The lesson it would teach, whether layered defense is viable against mass salvo attack or that it is not, would reshape the strategic calculations of every state facing a ballistic missile threat. For Taiwan, for South Korea, for the Gulf states, for NATO's eastern flank, the performance of Israel's missile defense under maximum stress would be the most operationally relevant data point available for their own defense investment decisions. The first lesson would be about the relationship between proxy forces and state-on-state conflict. If the conflict demonstrates that Iran's proxy network can impose decisive costs on Israel, other state actors with proxy relationships will draw the conclusion that this model is viable. Chom II, Missile Saturation and Defense Penetration. Comprehensive operational data about which missile types can penetrate layered missile defense, immediately relevant to missile program development globally. The third, the limitations of air power at extended range. Israel's ability to conduct sustained precision strike operations against Iran at distances of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers would define the practical ceiling of what medium-power precision air campaigns can achieve. A full-scale Iran-Israel war has not happened. The most important structural observation is this. The April and October 2024 direct exchanges were calibrated to avoid becoming a full-scale war. Both sides demonstrated capability without committing to the sustained campaign that would produce the dynamics analyzed here. The restraint demonstrated in those exchanges is itself a form of deterrence signaling, each side demonstrating what it can do without doing all of it. Whether that restraint is durable, and under what circumstances it would break down, is the central strategic question of the Iran-Israel relationship in the near term. The answer depends on decisions made in Jerusalem and Tehran, on the trajectory of regional conflicts that neither capital fully controls, and on the specific circumstances of any given crisis moment. What can be determined is the system that would activate if those decisions go wrong, and understanding that system is the precondition for the policies and preparations that might prevent its activation. Structure shapes what is possible. In the Iran-Israel relationship, what is possible remains, for now, short of full-scale war. Understanding why and understanding what would change that is where the analysis must begin. You have been watching The Command Structure. Subscribe if you think in systems.